Imagine stepping into a world of luxury, only to be told you don't belong. Imagine paying for dignity, but receiving humiliation instead. That's exactly what happened to the Carter family on their flight from New York to London. From the very first words spoken by the lead flight attendant, sharp, dismissive, dripping with prejudice, this was never going to be an ordinary journey. 16-year-old Naomi Carter froze in the aisle. Her little brother Malik shrank under the weight of cruel words, and their mother Elena bristled with quiet fury. But sitting beside them was David Carter, a man of calm strength, a strategist who believed that sometimes the most powerful response is silence, until the right moment to strike. What no one on that plane realized, not even the smug attendant herself, was that David Carter wasn't just a passenger in seat 2A. He was the CEO, the man who owned the airline they were flying on, and every slight, every smirk, every humiliation was being tallied for a reckoning that would change everything. Will prejudice win when it hides behind authority, or will dignity find its voice at 35,000 feet? Stay with us, and before we dive into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss stories that reveal truth, justice, and the power of standing tall. David Carter adjusted the cuff of his navy blazer as he stepped into the first-class cabin of Atlantic Sky Flight 742 from New York to London. His wife, Elena, followed just behind him with their 2 children, Naomi and Malik. The cabin should have been a sanctuary of calm, the kind of place where travelers were greeted with champagne and warm smiles. But instead, the very first words David and his family heard carried the weight of an insult. "Sweetheart, economy's back that way." The voice came sharp and quick, tinged with a smirk that cut through the soft hum of the aircraft's ventilation system. Standing in the aisle was Clara Whitmore, the senior flight attendant, her posture stiff as she blocked the entrance with her manicured hand. Her blonde hair was twisted into a severe bun, her lips painted a red that clashed against her pale skin. Naomi, just 16, froze mid-step. Her hand tightened around the strap of her backpack until her knuckles whitened. Her cheeks flushed not from embarrassment, but from the sting of being judged so openly in front of a cabin full of strangers. She wanted to speak, to say that she did belong here, but the words refused to move past her throat. Behind her, Elena Carter laid a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. She looked elegant in her tailored cream blazer, her presence quiet yet commanding. Elena did not need to raise her voice to make a point, but even she felt her jaw tighten at Clara's tone. Then there was David, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered. His calm presence filled the narrow aisle. He said nothing, not yet. His face was composed, unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. He had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any blade. Clara's gaze flicked over Naomi from head to toe, the smirk lingering at the corners of her mouth as though daring the family to challenge her. For a long second, the cabin air seemed to freeze. Passengers shifted in their wide leather seats, sensing the tension. Some avoided looking directly, turning their eyes toward their champagne flutes. Others leaned ever so slightly, curious to catch what might unfold. Naomi swallowed hard and held up her boarding pass like a shield. The cardstock trembled in her grip as though it might prove her right to exist in this space. Clara reached out with deliberate slowness, scanning the passes, seats 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, all clearly marked as first class. Clara's smile faltered, but did not disappear. "Right this way," she said, her tone stripped of the false sweetness she had used on the passengers before them. David placed a steadying hand on Naomi's shoulder. guiding her forward. He did not break his calm. To speak too soon would be to waste a lesson that needed to unfold. He knew from the moment Clara opened her mouth that she had made the gravest mistake of her career. But he also knew that exposing her for who she truly was required patience. As they moved down the aisle, Elena's hand brushed against David's. It was a subtle gesture, a signal they had used for years. It meant I see it too. It meant I am with you. The Carters settled into their seats. Plush, private suites awaited them, with sliding doors, wide screens, and folded blankets set neatly at the side. Everything about the environment whispered luxury. Yet the sting of Clara's words lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Naomi sat rigidly, trying not to look around at the strangers who had witnessed the exchange. Her heart pounded with a mix of humiliation and quiet anger. She wanted to disappear into the soft leather, to pretend it had never happened. But she couldn't. The words echoed in her mind. Economy's back that way. Malik, only 9, fidgeted with the seat controls, oblivious to the undercurrent. For him, this was an adventure. His first time flying across the Atlantic, his first time in a seat that reclined all the way flat. He didn't understand why his sister's eyes were downcast, or why his mother's lips pressed tightly together. David leaned back in his seat, folding his hands in his lap. To anyone else, he looked at ease, but inside, his mind was already moving. He tallied each slight, each word, each shift in body language. He had built his empire on discipline and timing, knowing when to hold back and when to strike. Business had taught him that lessons delivered at the right moment carried far more weight than those shouted in anger. Elena turned slightly toward him, her voice low, meant only for his ears. "She doesn't know who you are," she whispered. "That's the point," David murmured, his gaze steady on the aisle. "Let her show her true self first." Naomi glanced at her father. Confusion etched across her face. She admired his calm, but a part of her wondered why he didn't just shut it down. Why not tell this woman right away that he was not only a paying passenger, but the owner of the very airline she worked for? She didn't understand yet that silence was strategy. Across the aisle, a businessman in seat 1A lifted his glass of champagne. Completely unfazed, he had been greeted warmly, offered a choice of wines, and now sipped from fine crystal. Naomi noticed the difference and felt the burn of injustice spread deeper in her chest. David caught her eye, and with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, he leaned closer. "Some people," he said softly, "build their world on shaky assumptions. Don't let their foundation become yours." Naomi blinked, holding on to his words. But the sting didn't fade. She knew this was not over, not by a long shot. As the engines began to hum and the aircraft door closed, Clara moved gracefully through the cabin. Her voice was warm again, her laughter light as she chatted with the couple in seats 1C and 1D. She leaned in close, her gestures animated. Then, when she turned toward the Carters, her warmth vanished as if a switch had been flipped. David watched silently, his expression calm, but inside, he cataloged every detail. He had no intention of letting it slide. This was not just about service. It was about dignity, about what happens when prejudice collides with quiet, unshakable power. And David Carter was a man who always knew the exact moment to make his move. Naomi Carter sat stiffly in her seat as the aircraft began its slow taxi toward the runway. The weight of Clara Whitmore's words still pressed down on her chest. She had grown up in a household where her parents constantly reminded her that she belonged anywhere her mind and hard work could carry her. Yet here she was, barely a teenager, being told with a smirk that she was in the wrong place. She tapped her phone screen and opened her notes app. Her fingers hovered before typing a single sentence. Why do they look at us like we don't belong? Her mother, Elena Carter, noticed. Alona had a way of noticing everything. Years as a corporate attorney had sharpened her instincts. Now, after stepping back from law to focus on philanthropy, she still carried herself like a woman who saw the hidden structures of every room she entered. She leaned slightly toward her daughter, brushing a loose strand of hair from Naomi's cheek. Her voice was low but calm. Do not let her define you. Not with words, not with looks. People reveal themselves far more loudly than they realize. What she said has nothing to do with you and everything to do with her. Naomi nodded but did not answer. At 16, her heart burned too brightly to let reason quiet it. She wanted to shout, to demand fairness. Yet she also knew her father's eyes were always watching, always measuring the right moment. David Carter had not spoken since they sat down. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but anyone who truly knew him could see the stillness of a man sharpening his thoughts. He had built Carter Global from a startup consultancy into a multinational powerhouse by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Silence was never weakness for David. It was calculation. He understood that people revealed more in their assumptions than they ever did in their apologies. He glanced at his wife. Elena met his eyes with the faintest trace of a smile. Their marriage was one of unspoken languages. A glance here, a shift of posture there, a small squeeze of the hand. It was a dance they had perfected over 20 years together. And right now, Elena's message was clear. Our daughter is hurting, but we trust your judgment. David exhaled slowly. He was not a man easily provoked, but he was also not a man who forgot. 9-year-old Malik Carter, oblivious to the storm swirling among the adults, grinned as he pressed buttons on the seat console. The chair reclined smoothly, then returned upright, then slid forward again. His small voice carried with a mixture of excitement and awe. Mom, it goes all the way down like a bed. Elena chuckled softly, smoothing her son's hair. Yes, sweetheart, but maybe don't test it 20 times before we even take off. Malik giggled and settled back, tugging at the soft blanket folded beside him. His world was still simple. Airplanes were an adventure, not a battlefield for dignity. He did not notice the stiffness in his sister's shoulders or the way passengers stole quick glances at their family. He only saw the thrill of flying over the ocean for the very first time. As the engines roared and the aircraft lifted into the evening sky, David looked out the wide window. The Manhattan skyline glittered against the fading light, a reminder of everything he had worked for and everything still at stake. To him, this trip was more than just a family getaway. It was also a chance to finalize negotiations with European partners that would shape the future of his company. But most importantly, it was time with his family, time he guarded fiercely in a life often consumed by boardrooms and contracts. Elena reached into her leather tote and pulled out a slim paperback book. She always carried one when she traveled, a habit from her law school days. Today's choice was a collection of essays on resilience, something she often revisited. She opened it, but did not read. Her mind was on Clara Whitmore, on the way her daughter's confidence had dimmed in a single moment. Elena's protective instincts flared. She wanted to confront the woman herself, to slice through the arrogance with a lawyer's precision. But she also knew her husband's style. He was waiting. He always waited. And when he finally acted, the result was never small. Naomi slipped in her earbuds and scrolled through her music. She tried to focus on lyrics, on melodies, on anything other than the burning memory of Clara's smirk. Yet no matter how she tried, her mind replayed it again and again. The humiliation, the subtle way passengers had looked at her, some with sympathy, others with quiet judgment. She clenched her jaw. She had spent years excelling at school, proving herself in debate competitions, carrying herself with pride. But one moment in a luxury cabin had reduced her to feeling like an intruder. She glanced at her father again. His calm was both reassuring and frustrating. Why didn't he just end it? Why didn't he pull rank and show her who he really was? She had seen him in action before, commanding conference rooms with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. She had seen powerful men fold under his quiet authority. Why hold back now? David sensed her eyes on him. He turned slightly, offering a calm smile. "Patience," he whispered. "Patience is a weapon most people never learn to use." Naomi blinked, her frustration bubbling. She wanted action, not philosophy. But she bit her tongue, trusting him even when she did not fully understand. Meanwhile, Clara moved through the aisle with polished efficiency. She offered menus to passengers across the cabin, her tone bright and friendly. When she reached the Carters, however, her cheer dimmed like a light switch flicked off. She did not hand them the embossed menus. Instead, she spoke quickly, rattling off 2 uninspired options without eye contact. Elena's eyes narrowed. Her voice was calm, but the steel was unmistakable. "Could we see the full menu? Please." Clara hesitated, then gave a thin smile. "We will see what is available," she said curtly, before moving on without taking their order. Naomi's fists clenched under the table. "She is lying," she hissed, her voice low but fierce. David placed a hand gently on her arm. His touch was grounding, steady. "I know," he murmured, "and she just gave us exactly what we need." Naomi frowned, confused. To her, they were being denied dignity. To him, it was evidence, a pattern. Each slight was another piece of the puzzle he was quietly assembling. He was not just enduring this, he was preparing to expose it. Elena caught his eye again. Her lips curved into the faintest smirk. She knew her husband too well. This was not the silence of surrender. This was the silence before a move that would shift the entire board. Passengers 2 rows ahead laughed as Clara knelt slightly to show them the wine list. Her tone filled with charm. The contrast was glaring. Naomi felt the sting again, but this time she noticed something else. Other passengers were watching too. Some avoided looking, but others shifted uneasily, sensing the imbalance. For David, that was important. A private injustice was easier to dismiss. A public one left witnesses, and witnesses carried weight. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. A hush fell across the suites, the atmosphere calm on the surface but electric beneath. David leaned back, hands folded, eyes half closed. To anyone else, he looked like a man settling into a long flight. But inside, he was charting the course of a conflict that Clara had already lost without even realizing it. And as Naomi sat silently with her earbuds in, and Elena returned to her book without turning a page, and Malik drifted into childish chatter about clouds and oceans, one truth hovered above them all. This was not simply about rudeness. It was not about bad service or a bad mood. It was about something far deeper, about the quiet ways dignity could be stripped and the quiet ways it could be reclaimed. For now, David Carter let the moment breathe, but in the quiet of his mind, he whispered the same word he had given his daughter: patience. The aircraft had settled into its climb, the steady roar of the engine smoothing into a softer hum. Outside the wide oval windows, the sky shifted from twilight to a deepening indigo, streaked with the last glimmers of orange fading over the Atlantic horizon. Inside, the first-class cabin glowed with soft mood lighting, casting a warm hue over the leather seats and polished wood accents. Every detail of the cabin seemed designed to signal exclusivity. The seats were private suites, each with sliding doors for privacy. Blankets folded with military precision rested atop the wide seats. Noise-canceling headphones gleamed inside compartments lined with velvet. The fragrance of espresso and warm bread drifted faintly from the galley. The air itself seemed engineered to feel more refined than the recycled oxygen in economy. For most passengers, it was a seamless illusion of comfort and prestige. For the Carters, it was a stage of contradictions. Naomi shifted uncomfortably, her gaze sliding toward the businessman across the aisle. He was already sipping his second glass of champagne, his laughter loud enough to carry. She noticed the way Clara leaned in close to him, her voice suddenly lighter, animated. Clara's hands gestured toward the menu he held, pointing out selections with practiced charm. She even touched his shoulder briefly, an exaggerated courtesy, as if to underline his importance. Naomi looked down at her own console. There was no glass of champagne, no sparkling water and crystal, not even the glossy menu other passengers now leafed through. Only a small plastic cup with lukewarm water sat in front of her, condensation pooling on the tray table. The comparison made her stomach twist. She turned her face toward the window, not wanting Clara to see the frustration in her eyes. She told herself not to care, but she cared deeply. It was not about champagne. It was about being seen, about being treated as though she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Malik, sitting next to her, was still enchanted by his suite. He giggled as he scrolled through the entertainment screen, choosing cartoons. He clapped softly when the screen flickered to life with bright colors. Helena smiled at him, grateful for his innocence, even as her own anger simmered beneath the surface. Helena had always prided herself on composure. Years in courtrooms had trained her to hold her ground under pressure, to dismantle opponents with precise logic. But there was something different about watching her children subjected to subtle scorn. It pierced through her carefully built armor. She wanted to rise, to confront Clara outright, to strip away the facade of professionalism the woman hid behind. But she stayed seated, her hand brushing against David's knee, grounding herself in patience she did not fully feel. David noticed. Of course. He noticed everything. The curve of his wife's lips tightening, the way Naomi's foot tapped restlessly beneath the table, the way Clara's body language shifted when she approached different passengers. He filed it all away, quiet but meticulous. Clara reappeared with a tray of hot towels. She carried them on a small silver platter for the couple in the front row, offering each towel with a smile and a soft, "Here you go, sir. Here you go, ma'am." When she reached the Carters, she did not bother with the tray. She dropped the towels directly onto the armrest without a word, her eyes sliding away as though they were invisible. Naomi's lips parted in disbelief. Helena inhaled sharply, ready to say something, but David gave the slightest shake of his head. "Not yet." Naomi leaned closer to him. Her whisper trembled with suppressed outrage. "Dad, are you seriously just going to let her treat us like this?" David's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Do you think I am letting her?" Naomi frowned, not understanding. "It looks like it." He leaned closer, his voice low. Every sleight is another card she places on the table. The higher the stack, the harder it will fall. Let her build it. Naomi sat back, frustrated but quiet. She wanted to argue, but the weight of his certainty silenced her. Across the aisle, Clara continued her routine with animated warmth. She knelt again to show the wine list to the couple in 3A and 3B. She laughed softly at their jokes, her hand brushing against the man's seat as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. The contrast could not have been clearer. Elna turned her face toward David, her voice soft but sharp. She is daring us to react. David nodded slightly. Exactly. Which means she has no idea who she is dealing with. The plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers adjusted, some reclining, some already setting up laptops. The illusion of calm settled over the cabin, but for the Carters, the air felt heavier with every passing moment. Naomi tried to distract herself by pulling out a magazine from the seat pocket. She flipped pages without reading, her mind too clouded. Every sound from Clara reached her ears too loudly. The clink of crystal glasses, the soft laughter directed at others but never at them, the clipped, dismissive tone. Whenever she spoke near their row, her chest tightened with a thought she had not wanted to face. What if this is what the world really thinks of us, that we are always out of place, always intruders? She glanced at her father again. His calm unsettled her. She could not decide if it was strength or surrender. Elena sensed her daughter's turmoil. She leaned slightly toward Naomi, whispering gently, "You know your father. He does not fight small battles. He waits for the one that ends the war." Naomi looked down, her throat tight. She wanted to believe her mother, but the ache of humiliation was too fresh. Meanwhile, Malik tapped her arm with excitement. "Naomi, look, they have the cartoon I like." His smile was wide, innocent, and she could not help but soften, at least for a moment. She ruffled his hair, her anger blunted by his joy. David finally leaned back, closing his eyes as though resting, but his mind was sharp. He was mapping the situation like a chessboard. Claire had exposed herself with each action, each word. The difference between how she treated others and how she treated his family was too blatant to be dismissed. And more importantly, passengers were noticing. He caught their glances, the way some shifted uncomfortably. The stage was being set, not by him, but by her. He thought of the countless times he had been underestimated in his career, the quiet rooms where his presence had been questioned until he proved his worth. He had grown used to it, though it never lost its sting. But this was not about him. This was about his children. Naomi deserved to know she belonged without question. Malik deserved to grow up in a world where his innocence was not poisoned by prejudice. David opened his eyes, his gaze locking briefly on Clara as she passed by once more. Her smirk had returned, subtle but there, as though she had won something. She did not realize she had already lost. Naomi stared at him, searching for some sign. All he offered was the faintest trace of a smile, calm and unshaken. To Naomi, it was maddening. To Elena, it was familiar. To David, it was strategy. The contradiction of the cabin deepened. Luxury draped over every visible surface. Yet dignity was denied in invisible ways. Comfort was advertised, but exclusion was delivered. For those who never faced it, the contradictions went unnoticed. For the Carters, they were impossible to ignore. And as the night sky swallowed the last trace of the horizon, David Carter made a quiet promise to himself. This would not end here. This stage of contradictions would soon become the stage of reckoning. Dinner service began with a quiet announcement over the cabin speakers. Passengers in first class were invited to choose from a curated menu featuring roasted lamb with rosemary glaze, seared halibut with citrus beurre blanc, or handmade ricotta ravioli. The descriptions alone carried an air of ceremony, as though the food itself was part of the luxury being sold. The scent of something rich and savory drifted from the galley, filling the air with promises of indulgence. Naomi's eyes flickered toward the rows ahead. She watched as Clara Whitmore glided toward a couple seated in 1C and 1D, presenting them with menus bound in leather. Clara's voice was honey-sweet, each word carefully wrapped in charm. The couple smiled, their heads bent over the menu as though they were guests at a fine restaurant. Clara lingered, pointing out wine pairings, her laugh floating through the cabin like soft music. When Clara reached the Carters, her demeanor shifted once again. The smile thinned, the warmth drained from her tone. She did not present menus. Instead, she stood stiffly in the aisle, pen poised, eyes refusing to meet theirs. "For you," she said flatly. "Pasta is the only option left. We are out of the others." Elena raised her eyebrows, her composure steady but her disbelief clear. "Already out?" she asked, her voice calm but clipped. Clara gave a tight nod. "Yes. Pasta or nothing." Naomi's jaw dropped. She had just seen Clara confirm lamb orders 2 rows ahead. The smell of roasted meat still lingered in the air. She wanted to shout, to call out the lie. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, her father's hand touched her arm lightly. "It's fine," David said softly. His voice was calm, steady, but his eyes never left Clara's. Clara scribbled on her pad and moved on without another word. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. "Dad, you saw I saw—" David interrupted gently. "I saw everything." She swallowed her protest, but frustration bubbled inside her chest. Why was he allowing this? Why didn't he stand up and tell Clara that she was wrong? Naomi's mind raced, her heart burning with indignation. She could feel her mother's quiet tension beside her, the way Elena's hand had curled slightly into a fist before she relaxed it again. Minutes later, a tray arrived. 2 bowls of pasta primavera were placed in front of them. The vegetables looked limp, the sauce thin and watery. Across the aisle, the businessman in 1A received his lamb with ceremony. The silver cloche lifted to reveal a perfectly plated dish, steam rising as Clara smiled and poured a glass of red wine. Naomi's fork clinked against her bowl. She could not even force herself to eat. Her stomach twisted with anger. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. Malik poked at his pasta with curiosity, unaware of the difference. To him, food was food, and he was too distracted by the novelty of eating on an airplane to notice the insult. He slurped a noodle and giggled when it splashed a bit of sauce on his napkin. Elena picked up her fork with deliberate calm, her every movement precise. She did not want Clara to see her flinch, did not want to give the satisfaction of visible frustration, but her silence was not surrender. It was a razor waiting for the right moment. Naomi's chest ached. She turned toward her mother, her whisper urgent. "We cannot just let her do this." Elena's eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. "We can," she said quietly, "because we decide what happens next, not her." Naomi wanted to believe it, but she could not shake the humiliation. Every time Clara walked past, she saw the curl of a smirk at the edge of her mouth, as if the attendant had swallowed something bitter and was determined to spread the taste. David sat back, watching. His face remained calm, but his mind was working. He was not just taking notes in his head. He was studying the shape of the problem, tracing the outlines of a system flaw revealed by one woman's behavior. He had learned in business that small cracks often pointed to deeper fractures beneath the surface. Clara was not just one attendant with a bad attitude. She was a symptom of something larger, something systemic. And he knew that when they landed, it would not simply be Clara who faced consequences, but here, in this cabin, the battle was still playing out. The breaking point came with something so small it might have been dismissed by anyone else. Malik, distracted by the glow of his screen and the wobble of his glass, accidentally tipped over his apple juice. The liquid spilled across the armrest, dripping toward the aisle. Clara spun around almost instantly, her eyes flashing. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Control your children," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, loud enough to make passengers in nearby suites glance up. Malik froze. His small hands gripped his napkin, his wide eyes filling with fear. He had not meant to spill, had not meant to cause trouble. He was only 9. Elena set down her fork slowly, her movements deliberate. She turned her head toward Clara, her voice low, measured, but razor sharp. "You will not speak to my son in that tone again." The words sliced through the air, leaving silence in their wake. Naomi's heart pounded, relief mixing with pride. Her mother's voice had always had that power, even when she was in law school. Firm, controlled, undeniable. Clara's smirk returned, as though she had won something. "Some people just don't know how to behave in first class," she muttered under her breath, loud enough to be heard. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air heavier with tension. Naomi gripped her armrest, her jaw tight. Malik sat frozen, still clutching his napkin. Elena's eyes narrowed, but she remained poised. David leaned back in his seat, his lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile, so subtle it could be missed. He knew what Clara did not. She had just taken one step too far. Naomi's anger burned in her chest. She wanted to leap to her feet, to shout, to tell everyone what Clara was doing. But then she saw her father's face, saw the calm behind his eyes, and she understood that something was coming, something bigger than a single outburst. Clara moved away, her steps brisk, her shoulders stiff. Elena reached for a napkin, dabbing at the spill on the armrest with precise movements, her eyes still locked on the aisle. Naomi leaned closer, whispering fiercely, "She cannot talk to us like that." "She can," Elena said softly, "and she just did. But remember what your father said. Patience." David placed his glass of sparkling water back onto the tray table, the plastic rim clicking softly. He turned his gaze toward Clara, who was now bending low to refill the wine glasses of passengers 2 rows ahead. Her laugh floated through the air, light and charming once again. He folded his hands. His mind was clear. Clara had already written her own ending. All he needed to do was decide when to turn the page. For Naomi, the wounds of the evening felt sharp and fresh. For Elena, they stacked like layers of ice, thin but impossible to ignore. For Malik, the moment was confusing, his innocence bruised by a sharpness he could not name. And for David Carter, it was no longer just about a meal or a tone of voice. It was about dignity itself, and about what happens when the quiet weight of prejudice collides with the calm resolve of power. The flight was only just beginning. The storm, he knew, was still gathering. The cabin settled into an uneasy rhythm as trays clinked. Forks scraped against plates, and wine glasses were refilled with deliberate grace. For most of the passengers, The flight unfolded like an evening at a high-end restaurant suspended in the sky. For the Carters, it was an exercise in restraint. Every passing minute carried another small reminder that they were outsiders in a space they had paid for just like everyone else. Naomi felt the sting of each moment more sharply than anyone else. She was 16, old enough to notice every slight, young enough to feel each one cut deep. She watched Clara lean down beside a woman in row 3, her voice light and playful as she described the wine selection. Clara's hand rested lightly on the passenger's shoulder, her smile wide as if they were old friends. When Clara turned toward the Carters, the warmth vanished. She didn't bend down to meet their eyes. She didn't linger to ask if they wanted dessert or coffee. Instead, she dropped 2 plastic cups of water onto the table without a word. The thud of plastic against polished wood echoed louder in Naomi's ears than it should have. Her stomach twisted. She looked at the businessman across the aisle who received another pour of wine in a crystal glass. His laughter rang out as if the world itself was tailored to him. She turned back to her own table and saw the dull sheen of her plastic cup. The contrast made her chest ache. She leaned toward her mother, her whisper sharp with frustration. "She is doing it on purpose." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "Of course she is. But her behavior does not define you. Naomi, remember that." Naomi clenched her fists under the table, but everyone sees it. They all see it, and nobody says anything. Her words hung in the air. Elena glanced briefly at her husband, then back to her daughter. Sometimes silence speaks too. Not everyone who sees will approve, and not everyone who disapproves will act. But believe me, people are watching. David sat quietly, his expression calm. He had not said much since dinner service began, but he was listening to every word. His daughter's anger was justified. He felt it too. Though years of discipline taught him to bury the fire beneath a layer of control, he wanted to tell her that the storm she longed for was coming, but he needed her to learn the value of timing. Naomi pressed her lips together, her chest tight with helplessness. She turned back toward the window, staring at the black ocean below, where nothing but clouds and moonlight broke the surface. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, a reminder of her own vulnerability. She hated feeling small. She hated that a stranger's words could make her question her own place. Clara returned with dessert for the other passengers. Each plate was carefully presented, miniature cheesecakes with caramel drizzle, slices of tiramisu dusted with cocoa, and chocolate strawberries gleaming under cabin lights. She carried the tray with ceremony, offering it to each row with a bright smile. When she reached the Carters, she walked past without stopping. The desserts disappeared into the seats behind them, her tray suddenly lighter as though their row didn't exist. Naomi's jaw dropped. "Did you see that?" she whispered fiercely. Elena's eyes darkened, though her voice remained steady. "We all saw it." David's gaze followed Clara as she moved on, his expression unreadable. He leaned back, folding his hands. To anyone else, he looked calm, almost indifferent, but Elena knew better. She had seen that exact posture before in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the quiet moments before he dismantled an opponent without raising his voice. Naomi pressed her palms flat against the table. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation. She wanted every passenger to hear what Clara had just done. But then she looked at her father, and something in his calm unsettled her. It was not surrender. It was something else, a kind of patience she could not yet master. Malik, meanwhile, sat with wide eyes, sensing the tension, but not understanding its depth. He tugged at his sister's sleeve. whispering, "Naomi, why didn't we get dessert?" Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth. But how could she? How do you explain prejudice to a 9-year-old without breaking a part of his innocence? She forced a smile and said softly, "Maybe they just forgot." But Malik's small frown showed he wasn't convinced. Elena's hand reached across the table, brushing Naomi's arm gently. "We protect him," she whispered. "Let him keep his light as long as he can." Naomi nodded, her eyes stinging. She swallowed hard, forcing down the burn in her throat. Across the cabin, Clara laughed again, her voice carrying like a bell. Naomi's stomach knotted. She wondered what it must feel like to be on the receiving end of that warmth, to be seen as worthy of charm instead of contempt. She felt her confidence shrinking under the weight of exclusion. Her father's voice broke into her thoughts, calm and steady. "Do not let her world define yours, Naomi." She turned to him, frustration bubbling. "But it feels like she's winning." David's eyes were sharp, unwavering. "She is only winning if you give her the power to decide your worth. And she never had that power." Naomi bit her lip, torn between belief and doubt. She wanted to trust his words, but the ache of humiliation still throbbed. The hours stretched on. The cabin lights dimmed, a signal for passengers to rest. Some reclined fully into their beds, pulling blankets over themselves. The illusion of serenity filled the air. But for the Carters, the silence was heavy. Naomi couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a storm. She thought about the way Clara had looked at her when they boarded, like she was lost. She thought about the way other passengers had turned their eyes away, unwilling to get involved. She thought about her younger brother, too innocent to understand, and her mother, composed but burning inside. She thought most of all about her father, sitting calmly beside her as if nothing had happened. Her heart pounded with questions. Why does he not fight back? Why does he sit so still while she humiliates us? Does he not feel the same anger I do? She turned her head to look at him. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, but she knew he wasn't asleep. He was never asleep in moments like this. She could see the quiet calculation in the lines of his face, the way his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. Naomi exhaled sharply and whispered, almost to herself, "I don't understand you." David opened his eyes slowly. He turned his head toward her, his gaze steady. "One day you will." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't yet grasp. She turned away again, frustrated but quiet. Elena shifted in her seat, glancing at both of them. She saw her daughter's turmoil and her husband's calm, and she knew the tension was reaching a breaking point. Clara had stacked slight upon slight, arrogance upon arrogance. Elena could feel the storm building, the air heavy with anticipation. In her mind, she counted the offenses, the smirk at boarding, the plastic cups, the denial of meals, the public scolding of her child, the desserts withheld. Each one was a cut, small but deliberate, sharp enough to wound. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. David had said patience was a weapon. Elena believed him, but patience had a limit, and Clara was racing towards it. Naomi closed her eyes, her fists tight under the blanket. She told herself she would not cry. She told herself she was stronger than that. But the tears pricked anyway, unbidden, born not just of humiliation, but of the deeper fear that this would never end. Malik shifted in his seat, his soft breathing settling into the rhythm of sleep. Elena watched her son's chest rise and fall, her heart tightening. She would not let him grow up in a world where this was normal. She would not. And David Carter, seated silently beside them, opened his eyes once more and looked toward the galley where Clara disappeared with her tray. His face was calm, but his decision was made. The quiet storm was no longer waiting. It was coming. Malik Carter had never been on such a long flight before. To him, the cabin was still an adventure, filled with buttons, screens, and new discoveries. He had been shifting in his seat for nearly an hour, adjusting the recline, pulling at the tray, checking the lights. His small hands fidgeted constantly, his mind too excited to settle. When Rachel, one of the junior attendants, had come earlier with a tray of juices, Malik had asked for apple. The cup now sat on the console beside him, half full, condensation sliding slowly down the side. Naomi had been trying to distract herself with music, her earbuds filling her head with noise she could not quite enjoy. Her eyes had been trained on Clara every time she moved past, waiting for the next small insult. She had been so focused on her anger that she almost missed the moment her brother's elbow brushed the cup. The apple juice toppled. Golden liquid spilled across the armrest, dripping onto the aisle. Malik gasped and snatched up a napkin, his small hands trembling as he tried to wipe it up. Before Naomi could help him, Clara appeared, her eyes narrowed, lips curling into a sneer. The sound of her voice cut through the calm cabin like glass breaking. "Control your children." The words came out sharp and loud, loud enough that the businessman across the aisle paused mid-sip. The couple 2 rows ahead looked back briefly. Naomi's chest seized. She felt the heat rise in her face, her heart hammering with disbelief. Malik froze, his wide eyes filled with panic, his tiny hands clutching the soggy napkin. His mouth opened as if to apologize, but no sound came. He looked at his father, then at his mother, his lower lip trembling. The silence that followed was suffocating. Naomi wanted to leap to her feet, to scream that her brother was only a child, but she did not need to. Elena Carter set her fork down slowly. Her movements were deliberate, precise, as though she were in a courtroom about to dismantle an opponent. She turned toward Clara, her voice low but edged with steel. "You will not speak to my son in that tone again." The words carried more force than volume. Naomi felt a surge of pride and relief, her own breath catching as she watched her mother's eyes narrow with precision. Elena's calm was dangerous. She was not raising her voice, but she was drawing a line carved in stone. Clara's smirk returned. "Some people just don't know how to behave in first class," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. The air grew heavier. Naomi's hands shook as she gripped her armrest. Malik ducked his head, his cheeks burning as though the entire cabin were staring at him. And they were. Naomi could feel it. Passengers who had been politely ignoring the tension were now fully alert. Some glanced quickly, then looked away. Others lingered, their eyes flickering between Clara and the Carters. The businessman in 1A shifted uncomfortably. His glass paused midair. David leaned back in his seat, his lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. It was not a smile of amusement, but one of recognition. The storm he had been waiting for had arrived. Clara had gone too far, and now the stage was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone watching. Naomi looked at him, her eyes wide. How could he stay so calm when Malik had just been humiliated? She wanted him to stand up, to unleash the full force of who he was. But all he did was rest his hands on the armrest, his eyes steady on Clara. Clara turned on her heel, muttering under her breath as she moved back toward the galley. Naomi's fist tightened. Her whole body shook with fury. She leaned close to her mother, her whisper sharp. "She cannot talk to us like that." Elena dabbed at the juice with a fresh napkin, her voice calm but cutting. "She can, and she just did. But that will not be the end of it." Naomi pressed her lips together, her throat tight. She looked at Malik, who was staring at his lap. His small shoulders slumped. The sight broke something inside her. Her little brother had come on this trip full of joy, eager for the adventure of flying overseas, and within hours someone had managed to dim that light. She reached out, touching his shoulder gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." Malik glanced at her, his eyes shiny with unshed tears. He nodded slowly, but his silence spoke louder than words. David finally moved. He picked up his glass of sparkling water, the plastic rim tapping against the tray table as he set it back down. The sound was small, but Naomi recognized it. It was his signal. A subtle punctuation mark. It meant he had decided. He turned slightly in his seat, his gaze following Clara as she reappeared to check on another row. His eyes tracked her with calm precision, like a hunter who had been waiting for his prey to step into the open. Naomi felt her chest tighten. She looked at her father, then at her mother, sensing something about to happen. Elna met her husband's gaze, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. She had seen this look countless times before. It was the look he wore when he was about to act in a way no one saw coming. Naomi's heart raced. She whispered, almost breathless, "You're going to do something." David didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Clara, his voice calm, but carrying weight. "I already am." The rest of the cabin continued as if nothing had happened. The lights were dim. Passengers reclined, some drifting toward sleep, others immersed in movies or books. But within the Carter's row, the air was electric, every breath thick with anticipation. Naomi glanced again at Malik, who had curled under his blanket, eyes squeezed shut as though trying to escape into sleep. She clenched her jaw. She would never forgive Clara for that look on her brother's face. Elena's hand slid into David's for just a second, a silent acknowledgement. She did not need to ask what he planned. She only needed to know that he would not let this stand. Clara passed by once more, her steps brisk, her smirk faint but present. David's gaze followed her, unblinking. Naomi shivered. She realized suddenly that her father's silence had not been weakness. It had been the gathering of a storm. Passengers who had been watching earlier shifted again, their curiosity rekindled. They could sense something building, even if they could not name it. They could feel the gravity in David's stillness, the quiet before thunder. Naomi leaned closer to him, her whisper urgent. "Dad, what are you going to do?" He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers with calm certainty. "Teach her what she refuses to learn." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask more, but the weight in his voice told her not to. The rest of the meal service passed with mechanical motions. Clara avoided their row as much as she could, tending to others with exaggerated cheer. Each laugh, each smile directed elsewhere only deepened the contrast. Naomi's fury had not cooled. If anything, it simmered hotter, pressing against her ribs. But for the first time, she began to understand her father's silence. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. As the cabin lights dimmed further and the hum of the engines filled the silence, David Carter leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. But behind his calm expression, he was wide awake. The decision had been made. The reckoning was coming, And Clara Whitmore, for all her smirks and sharp words, had no idea how close the storm was. The hum of the engines carried a steady rhythm, but inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Clara Whitmore had returned from the galley, her shoulders tight, her posture stiff. She walked with the authority of someone who had been in charge for years, yet her eyes flickered nervously whenever they passed the Carter family. David Carter sat upright now, no longer reclining in silence. His glass of water sat untouched on the table. He looked every bit the composed traveler, but Elena recognized the change immediately. His stillness had sharpened into focus. Naomi noticed it too. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, her heart quickening with anticipation. When Clara reached their row again, David's voice carried across the aisle. It was calm, polite even, but threaded with a weight that demanded attention. "Clara," he said evenly. She stopped, caught off guard by the use of her name. Most passengers did not bother to read her tag. She straightened, her lips tightening. "Yes?" Sir David tilted his head slightly, his tone conversational but deliberate. "How long have you been with Atlantic Sky?" Clara blinked. The question was simple, but something in his voice unsettled her. She hesitated, then answered, 13 years. That's quite a tenure," David replied. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging her service. "So you've been here through a number of policy changes." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "I suppose." David leaned forward just enough for his words to carry to the surrounding passengers. "Then I imagine you remember the Atlantic restructuring. The one where the in-flight service protocols for premium cabins were rewritten. That would have been, 8 years ago?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Clara's face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir." David's gaze remained steady. "Back then, premium guest training was called Module 4B. Ring a bell." The silence stretched. Naomi's eyes widened. Elena's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Clara shifted her weight, her composure slipping. "I don't know what you're trying to suggest," Clara said quickly, her tone defensive. David's voice did not rise. It remained smooth, calm, surgical. "I'm suggesting that a professional with 13 years of experience should not forget her own training, especially when it comes to respect, courtesy, and equal treatment of passengers." The words hung heavy in the air. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. Some pretended to look at their screens, but their ears strained to catch every syllable. Clara forced a smile, her cheeks taut. "If there's something specific you'd like to request," Sir David interrupted, his tone quiet but firm. "Respect, and the service my family paid for. Do you think you can manage that?" The smirk faltered. For the first time that evening, Clara seemed rattled. Her mouth opened, then closed. She gave a curt nod. "Of course." Her voice was tight, stripped of its earlier confidence. She turned to leave, but Elena's hand brushed lightly against David's. It was a subtle signal, one he immediately understood. "You are not finished." David sat back slowly, his gaze following Clara as she moved down the aisle. His expression remained calm, but Naomi could see something shift behind his eyes. This was no longer silence. This was strategy unfolding. Naomi's pulse raced. She whispered to her mother, "Did you see her face?" Elena's smirk deepened slightly. "Your father has a way of asking questions that feel like verdicts." Naomi glanced back at him, her frustration tempered by admiration. She was beginning to understand. He hadn't been waiting because he was afraid. He had been waiting for Clara to show her true self so completely that no one could deny it. And now she had. Minutes later, Clara returned with a tray of desserts for the other passengers. She carried them carefully, each plate decorated with precision. She offered slices of tiramisu and miniature cheesecakes, her voice suddenly sweet again as she leaned close to a couple in row 3. But when she passed the Carters, she didn't stop. The tray moved past their row as if they were invisible. Naomi felt her chest seize, her fists clenched, her nails biting into her palms. Malik stirred in his seat, glancing at the desserts longingly. But he said nothing. David rose slowly. At 6'2", his frame seemed to fill the narrow aisle. But it wasn't his height that made people look up. It was the deliberate way he moved, the calm command in his posture. Conversations in nearby suites faltered. "Clara!" he called. His tone was polite, but impossible to ignore. She turned, startled, the dessert tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Yes." Sir David stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Let's skip the formalities. Tell me, who's your regional director these days?" "Still, Andrew Benton." Clara froze. Her eyes widened slightly. "How do you know Andrew David didn't answer right away?" He let the silence press down on her before continuing. "And I assume the Pacific operations still run under the Service Excellence Initiative." SEI show for correct. Now Clara's brows furrowed. That was not information most passengers would ever know. It was the kind of detail discussed only in management briefings. Her lips parted. "You're not in the industry. Are you?" David's faint smile was sharp, controlled. "Let's just say I've been paying close attention to Atlantic Sky. Enough to know that your premium guest protocol hasn't been followed from the moment my family stepped on board. Enough to know how many steps you've skipped from Module 4B. And enough to have a conversation about it with people whose names you sign on your paychecks." The tray in Clara's hands wobbled. She steadied it quickly, her face paling. Passengers nearby stared openly now, no longer pretending to look away. Her voice faltered. "Sir, if I've done something to upset you—" "You've done more than that," David said evenly. His voice remained calm, but it cut like steel. "But here's your opportunity to course correct before this becomes a career-ending conversation." Clara swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" David gestured toward his wife and children. "Serve my family what they paid for. Bring the salmon, bring the lamb, bring the wine list. And next time you speak to my children, you address them with the same courtesy you show every other passenger in this cabin. Can you manage that?" For a long second, Clara didn't speak. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, she gave a short nod. "Of course," she said tightly. She turned and walked briskly toward the galley, her pace quicker than before. Helena leaned toward her husband, her voice low, her smile faint. "You're not done yet?" "Are you?" David sat back down, his eyes calm, his tone steady. "Not even close." Naomi sat frozen in her seat, her heart pounding. She had watched her father dismantle opponents in boardrooms, but seeing him do it here, in a place where she had felt powerless, lit something inside her. For the first time all evening, she felt a flicker of relief. Malik tugged at her sleeve, whispering softly, "Does this mean we get dessert too?" Naomi smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. "Yes, Malik, we will." The cabin seemed to hum with a different energy now. Clara's confidence had cracked. Passengers whispered quietly to one another. Their curiosity piqued. The Carters had gone from being invisible to becoming the center of attention. And David Carter, the strategist who always saw the board 3 moves ahead, had just made his opening move. When Clara returned from the galley, the tray in her hands carried salmon and lamb plated with perfect precision. The aroma of roasted herbs and citrus butter floated through the aisle as she set the meals down in front of the Carters. The plates gleamed under the cabin lights, each one covered until the moment of presentation. She placed them on the table without eye contact, her lips pressed into a tight line. Naomi noticed the difference immediately. Other passengers had been served with ceremony, the silver cloche lifted with a smile, the dish revealed like a treasure. For them, the gesture was mechanical, stripped of warmth. David did not thank her. He watched her carefully, then spoke in the same calm tone that had already unsteadied her. From this point forward, Clara, you will not be serving my family. Clara froze. Her eyes flicked toward him, disbelief flashing across her face. Excuse me. David folded his hands, his posture relaxed but commanding. Rachel will take over. You've made it clear you're unwilling or unable to provide the service we paid for. I've decided to make the change. Clara's cheeks flushed. Sir, I don't take orders from passengers. The faintest smile touched David's lips. You will today? The words carried like a strike across the cabin. Conversations faltered. A woman in row 3 paused with her fork in midair. Even the businessman in 1A tilted his head slightly, pretending not to listen, but very much listening. Clara's jaw tightened. If you have an issue, you can file a complaint after we land. David's voice did not rise. No, this is being addressed now. You will step away from this section. Rachel will continue service. That is not a suggestion. It's a directive. Clara's nostrils flared. A directive from who exactly? David held her gaze, the silence stretching long enough for her to feel its weight. Then he spoke evenly. From someone whose decisions can directly impact your career. And this conversation is already being documented in my mind for the report I'll be filing with your executive leadership team. Clara's lips parted, then closed again. For the first time that evening, she looked unsure of herself. She turned stiffly toward the galley, her heels clicking faster than before. Naomi exhaled sharply, a rush of adrenaline filling her chest. She whispered to her father, "That was incredible." David's eyes stayed on the aisle. That was only the beginning. Moments later, Rachel appeared. Her hands shook slightly as she placed fresh linens and crystal glasses on their table. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'll be taking care of you for the rest of the flight." Elena offered her a warm smile. "We appreciate your professionalism, Rachel." Rachel gave a small nod, relief flickering in her eyes. She poured sparkling water into crystal glasses, her movements careful, almost reverent. Naomi watched her and felt something inside her unclench. For the first time all evening, she felt seen. The shift in the cabin was immediate. The air seemed lighter, though tension still lingered like a storm cloud. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity no longer concealed. Naomi caught a man in 2F glance at her father with quiet recognition, as if realizing that David was not an ordinary passenger. Clara, meanwhile, hovered near the galley, her posture rigid. Her hands adjusted trays that did not need adjusting. Her lips pressed so tightly they seemed bloodless. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. Naomi leaned toward her mother, her whisper urgent. "Do you think she'll try again?" Elena's smirk returned. "She already lost. Every move she makes now will only dig her deeper." David sat quietly, sipping from his crystal glass, his expression calm. But Naomi could sense it. He was far from finished. The rest of the cabin seemed to hum with anticipation. Passengers who had initially pretended not to watch were now openly glancing toward the Carters. Even the businessman in 1A shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering between David and Clara as though watching a performance he had not expected. Naomi felt a strange surge of pride. For the first time since they boarded, she no longer felt invisible. Her father had turned the humiliation into something else, into power. Rachel returned with dessert, this time placing a full tray in front of them. Cheesecake drizzled with caramel, tiramisu dusted with cocoa, strawberries dipped in chocolate. The presentation was careful, equal to what others had received earlier. Malik's face lit up. His small voice broke the tension. Finally. Naomi laughed softly, brushing his hair back. She felt tears sting her eyes. But this time they weren't from anger. David glanced toward Clara, who stood stiffly by the galley curtain. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "The facade is cracking." Naomi tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, his eyes sharp but kind. People who build their authority on arrogance cannot stand when it's challenged. It only takes one push for the cracks to show. Naomi thought about it as she bit into the cheesecake. The sweetness was sharp on her tongue, but it carried something more, a taste of victory. The flight continued, the hours stretching into the quiet of the night. The cabin dimmed. Passengers reclined. But sleep did not come easily for Clara. Naomi noticed her pacing near the galley, her hands fidgeting, her posture no longer confident. The smirk that had haunted Naomi's memory was gone. In its place was a look of unease. Naomi leaned against her father, whispering softly, "You broke her." David's voice was calm. "No, she broke herself. All I did was hold up the mirror." Elena closed her book, her gaze shifting toward Clara. "Mirrors are dangerous for people who don't like what they see." Naomi let the words settle. She realized then that her father's silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy. Every slight, every insult had been another brick Clara placed in her own downfall, and David Carter had simply waited for the moment to let the wall collapse. The passengers in the cabin would leave with their own stories. Some would talk about the confrontation. Others would remember the shift in service, the sudden change of attendants. But one thing was certain. No one would forget the moment when a calm, quiet man in seat 2A shifted the balance of the room without ever raising his voice. Naomi felt a rush of something she had not expected: hope. Maybe the world could change, if only because people like her father refused to let arrogance stand unchallenged. She looked at him, her whisper barely audible. "You're going to finish this, aren't you?" David's gaze was steady, his faint smile sharp. "Yes, but not here. Not yet." Naomi shivered, not from fear, but from anticipation. She realized then that this night was not about desserts or drinks. It was about something larger. It was about dignity, respect, and the quiet reckoning that comes when power is wielded with patience. And as the aircraft soared through the dark Atlantic sky, Clara Whitmore stood in the galley, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. The cracks in her facade had begun to show. Rachel had just cleared the dessert tray when David leaned slightly toward her. His voice was low, calm, but carried a gravity that made her pause mid-step. "Rachel," he said evenly, "could you let Captain Harris know that David Carter in 2A has a personnel issue in first class that requires his immediate attention?" Rachel blinked. The request was unusual. Passengers didn't summon captains mid-flight, especially not with that level of certainty. But something in David's tone silenced any hesitation. She gave a quick nod. "Yes, sir." Naomi's eyes widened. She leaned toward her father, her whisper urgent. "You're calling the captain." David's gaze stayed steady on the aisle. "It's time." Elena's lips curved into the faintest smile. She recognized the weight of those words. Naomi's chest pounded. She felt the shift, the way the energy in their small suite seemed to ripple outward. Rachel disappeared behind the galley curtain. Clara, who had been lingering nearby, caught the exchange. Her face paled, the last of her smirk vanishing. She fidgeted with the edge of her uniform jacket, her composure slipping further. 2 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. A tall man in his late 50s stepped into the aisle. His presence commanded silence instantly. Captain Robert Harris had the kind of bearing that made people instinctively straighten in their seats. His crisp uniform, silver hair, and calm stride carried authority that didn't need to be announced. He walked directly to David's row. "Mr. Carter," he said with a firm handshake. "I was told there's a service concern requiring my attention." David gestured calmly toward his wife and children. "My family boarded this flight expecting the level of courtesy Atlantic Sky claims to stand for. That hasn't happened. From the moment we entered this cabin, we've been subjected to deliberate disrespect and discriminatory treatment from your lead attendant." The captain's gaze flicked toward Clara, who stood frozen a few rows away. "Is that accurate?" he asked, his voice sharp. Clara spoke quickly, her tone defensive. "They've been—" "Difficult guess, Captain." Naomi's mouth opened in outrage, but her mother's hand on her arm kept her still. Elena leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but razor-edged. "The only thing we have been is patient." The captain studied Elena's expression, then Naomi's flushed cheeks, then Malik's small frame half hidden under his blanket. He turned fully toward Clara. "You're relieved from service for the remainder of this flight. Rachel will take over your section. Please move to the crew rest area immediately." The color drained from Clara's face. "Captain, that's not a request," Captain Harris said firmly. "It's an order." The silence that followed was electric. Passengers in nearby suites pretended to look at their screens, but the satisfaction on some faces was unmistakable. A businessman in 1A shifted slightly, his expression almost approving. The couple in 3A exchanged glances, their smiles faint but clear. Naomi's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The woman who had smirked at her, who had humiliated her brother, was being dismissed mid-flight. She felt her throat tighten, tears pricking her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. Clara stood stiffly for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without another word, she turned sharply and walked down the aisle toward the rear crew quarters. Her shoulders were rigid, her steps clipped. David didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded to the captain. "Thank you for addressing it promptly." "My apologies to you and your family," Captain Harris said, his voice sincere. "You have my assurance this will be reviewed thoroughly after we land." David inclined his head. "I'll expect nothing less." The captain gave a respectful nod and returned to the cockpit. Rachel immediately stepped into Clara's place, moving with quiet determination. She placed fresh linens and crystal glasses on the Carter's table, her hands steady this time. Elena smiled at her warmly. "We appreciate you, Rachel." Rachel's shoulders relaxed. "I'll make sure you're comfortable," she said softly. The shift in the cabin was profound. Where there had been tension, there was now a current of quiet satisfaction. Passengers glanced at the Carters with new recognition. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed at having watched. Others allowed their approval to show openly. Naomi leaned toward her father, her voice hushed but filled with awe. "She's really gone." David took a sip from his glass, his expression steady. "For now. But the real consequences will start when we're back on the ground." Naomi felt her chest swell. For hours she had carried the weight of humiliation, the sting of being treated as though she didn't belong. Now she saw the shift, the way her father's calm had dismantled Clara without a single shout. Her heart raced with a new kind of pride. Elena's hand brushed lightly across David's arm. "You've waited long enough, and you did it without breaking a sweat." David's faint smile deepened. "Sometimes you don't need to raise your voice to make the world listen." Malik tugged at his sister's sleeve, his small voice breaking the heavy silence. "Does this mean she can't yell at me anymore?" Naomi bent down, hugging him tightly. "No, Malik, she won't bother you again." The innocence in his question, the relief in his voice, made Naomi's throat tighten. She kissed his forehead, determined never to let anyone dim his light again. As Rachel moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency, Naomi leaned against her seat, exhaling deeply. For the first time since boarding, she felt the tension in her chest ease, but she knew her father wasn't finished. She could see it in his eyes. Clara's removal was only the prelude. The real reckoning, Naomi realized, was yet to come. The plane soared on into the night, the cabin lights dim, the Atlantic stretching endlessly below. And in seat 2A, David Carter sat with his family, his mind already charting the next move. With Clara gone, the cabin felt transformed. The oppressive tension that had settled over the Carters since boarding seemed to dissolve into the dimmed lights and soft hum of the engines. Rachel moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency, her every gesture careful, professional, and genuine. She refreshed water glasses in crystal instead of plastic, placed neatly folded linens across the tables, and asked with sincerity if the family needed anything more. Elena thanked her warmly. Naomi did too, her voice gentler now that she no longer felt invisible. Malik beamed when Rachel brought him a small plate of fruit and an extra chocolate strawberry, whispering, "This one's just for you." His giggle filled the suite like sunshine, restoring a piece of innocence that Clara had tried to steal. Naomi leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. For the first time all night, she felt like she could breathe, but the relief was fragile. The sting of what had happened still lingered beneath the surface. She could feel it every time she remembered Clara's smirk, every time she replayed the sharpness of her voice when she snapped at Malik. She turned her head toward her father. David sat calmly, his eyes open, fixed on nothing in particular. He seemed at peace. But Naomi knew better. She had learned over the years that his silence meant he was thinking, building, calculating, preparing. "Dad," she whispered, careful not to wake her brother. "Why didn't you tell her who you are?" "Right away." David's gaze shifted toward her. His expression was unreadable for a moment before it softened. "Because if I had, she would have thought the problem was me, not her. She would have believed I was just another powerful man flexing his authority. But letting her show her true self exposed something deeper. It showed everyone here what happens when arrogance goes unchecked." Naomi's brow furrowed. "But it hurt. All night. It hurt." David nodded slowly. "Yes. And I wish I could have shielded you from that. But sometimes the lesson has to be larger than the moment. If we only punish one person without changing the system, then nothing really improves. Tonight wasn't just about her. It was about what needs to change after we land." Naomi swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, but her father's words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She thought of the passengers who had pretended not to notice, who had turned away while her family was being treated unfairly. And then she thought of the ones who had watched more openly when David began to speak, the shift in their faces as they realized what had been happening. She whispered softly, "Do you really think it will change?" David reached over, brushing his daughter's shoulder gently. "It has to. And if it doesn't, then I'll make sure it does." Elena, who had been listening quietly, placed her hand over his. Her eyes glistened with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "That's the difference between you and most people. David, you don't just fix it for us. You fix it for the next family, too." Naomi felt her chest tighten. Her mother's words rang true. She had seen it before in boardrooms, in community events, in the way her father carried himself when no one was watching. He never acted only for himself. He always thought of the people who would come after. Malik stirred in his seat, his head resting against Naomi's arm. He mumbled softly in his sleep, something about cartoons and strawberries. Naomi stroked his hair gently, her heart aching with tenderness. She vowed silently that she would never let him grow up believing he was less than anyone else. The hours stretched into the quiet of night. Most passengers had reclined fully into their suites, drifting into sleep under the dim blue glow of cabin lights. The Carters' suite was quiet, too, but none of them slept easily. Their minds were too full. Naomi watched the stars flicker through the window, thinking about the strange contradictions of the night. Luxury wrapped around them like a cocoon, yet it had taken so little for that illusion to shatter. She wondered if every space of privilege carried the same hidden cracks, waiting to be revealed. David finally closed his eyes, though Elena knew he wasn't asleep. He was never asleep when there was work to be done. She leaned closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're already planning the next step, aren't you?" He opened his eyes, meeting hers with a faint smile. "Always. What will it be?" David turned his gaze back toward the aisle. "This doesn't end on the plane. It ends in the boardroom, and it ends with change that sticks." Elena studied him, her lips curving into a soft, knowing smile. "Then I won't worry. Because you don't lose." Naomi shifted slightly, listening to their exchange. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, pride mingling with relief. Maybe she didn't fully understand her father's calm, but she understood now that it wasn't weakness. It was strength. The kind of strength that could move more than just one family's experience. It could shift the culture of an entire airline. The night deepened. Rachel checked in quietly, offering blankets and pillows, making sure the Carters were comfortable. Her presence was a balm, proof that kindness still existed even in a system where arrogance had thrived. Elena thanked her with genuine warmth, Naomi with a soft smile. Malik, half asleep, murmured a thank you too, making Rachel laugh gently. As Rachel moved on, Elena whispered, "She'll go far." David nodded. "She will. She just needs someone to clear the path." Naomi tilted her head. "You mean you're going to help her?" David's faint smile returned. "I'm going to make sure this company helps her. That's how change happens, not just by removing those who fail, but by lifting those who do right." Naomi's heart swelled again. She leaned back against her seat, staring at the ceiling. Maybe the world really could change if enough people believed in making it better. The engines droned steadily, carrying the aircraft closer to dawn. Outside the window, the first faint light of morning began to creep across the horizon, painting the clouds with pale streaks of gold. Naomi sat mesmerized, watching the darkness fade. It felt symbolic, as though the night of humiliation was giving way to the light of something new. Elena pulled the blanket tighter around Malik's small frame, brushing his hair back tenderly. She glanced at David again, her voice quiet but certain. Tomorrow begins something bigger, doesn't it? David's eyes stayed on the rising light outside. Yes, tomorrow begins change. The cabin remained hushed, passengers cocooned in sleep. But in row 2A, the Carter family sat awake, hearts heavy but spirits steady. They knew this night was not just about them. It was about dignity, about respect, about ensuring no family would ever again be told they didn't belong where they had every right to be. And as dawn broke over the Atlantic, David Carter closed his eyes not to rest, but to prepare. The first hints of dawn filtered through the oversized windows as the Atlantic Sky Boeing 787 began its slow descent into London. The cabin stirred awake, passengers stretching beneath blankets, attendants moving softly through the aisles with trays of fresh fruit, pastries, and steaming coffee. For most, the flight had been uneventful luxury, an interlude of comfort before the business of the day began. For the Carters, it had been something else entirely, something that shifted the air around them in ways impossible to ignore. Rachel moved gracefully, setting down breakfast for Elena and Naomi, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of David with a gentle smile. Malik yawned, rubbing his eyes before brightening at the sight of croissants and orange slices. "Morning already?" he asked sleepily, his voice still thick with dreams. Naomi chuckled softly. "Yes. Malik, almost there." She broke a croissant in half and slid the piece onto his plate. It felt almost normal. Almost. Until the curtain near the galley opened. Naomi's breath caught. Clara stepped into the cabin, but she was no longer in her crisp navy jacket, the uniform that had carried an air of authority. Instead, she wore the plain red smock assigned to junior crew, her hair slightly undone, her posture smaller than Naomi had ever seen it. The sight was jarring. Passengers glanced up, some blinking in surprise, others whispering quietly. Clara avoided eye contact as she moved down the aisle, carrying a tray of plastic cups filled with orange juice. She stopped at row 5, setting them down mechanically, her voice flat. Naomi stared, her chest tightening. It was like watching a queen stripped of her crown, forced to serve at the level she had once looked down upon. She leaned toward her father, whispering, "She's in economy." David didn't move his gaze from the window, where the clouds below broke into patches of green countryside. His voice was calm, measured. "She's exactly where she thought we belonged." The word struck Naomi like a spark. She turned back toward Clara, who had moved further down the aisle. Her every step weighted with humiliation. Naomi should have felt triumphant, but instead she felt something else, something heavier. Justice, she realized, wasn't always sweet. Sometimes it was sobering. Eleanor reached for her coffee, her expression composed. "It's poetic," she murmured, "but this is not the end." Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" Her mother's eyes softened. "Being reassigned mid-flight is humiliation, but what your father is planning, that will be lasting change." Naomi sat back, her mind whirling. She thought about all the small humiliations that had built up since boarding, how each had cut her deeper. Seeing Clara stripped of her seniority should have felt like victory, and in some ways it did. But the ache inside her told her that victory alone wasn't enough. Passengers nearby whispered in low voices. Naomi caught fragments. Never seen a lead removed mid-flight. The captain himself stepped in. That family in 2A The attention made her cheeks flush, though not with shame. For the first time, the looks weren't dismissive. They carried curiosity, even respect. Malik munched happily on his croissant, oblivious to the stares, his innocence unshaken now that Clara was gone. He leaned toward Naomi and whispered with a grin, "See? We got better food after all." Naomi hugged him tightly, pressing a kiss to his hair. He didn't understand the weight of what had happened, and maybe that was a blessing. Rachel returned with hot towels, placing them gently on their trays with a warm smile. Elena thanked her, then glanced at David. "She deserves more than this role." David nodded slowly. "She'll have it. When we land, she'll be the first name I put forward." Naomi's eyes widened. "You mean a promotion?" David's voice was calm. "Leadership is not just about punishing those who fail. It's about lifting those who do right." Naomi felt her chest swell with pride again. Her father's words weren't just talk. They were a blueprint for something larger, something that stretched beyond this single flight. As the aircraft descended lower, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach into London Heathrow. Please return to your seats and ensure your belts are fastened." The cabin shifted as passengers prepared. Trays collected. Seats returned to upright positions. Rachel moved swiftly, making sure everything was in order. Clara trailed at the very back now, her movements mechanical, her presence a shadow of what it had been hours earlier. Naomi couldn't stop staring. She remembered the smirk, the condescension, the sting of being told she didn't belong. And now here Clara was, stripped bare in front of the same passengers she had once performed for. It was justice. Yes. But Naomi wondered if it would change anything. Would Clara leave this flight changed? Or would she cling tighter to the bitterness that had driven her cruelty? She turned to her father, whispering, "Do you think she'll ever understand, Mao?" David's eyes stayed on the skyline emerging through the clouds. The city of London stretched below, bathed in morning light. Maybe, maybe not. But this was never about her alone. This is about the system that let her think she could act this way without consequence. And that system is what's going to change. Naomi let the words settle. She felt her shoulders relax, her anger easing into something steadier resolve. The landing gear deployed with a muffled thud, the plane lowering steadily toward the runway. Passengers tightened their belts, the quiet murmur of conversation fading into silence. Naomi reached for Malik's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Elena rested her hand on David's arm, grounding them all. Through the window, Naomi watched as the runway drew closer, the city stretching out in all directions. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. She knew instinctively that what happened in the air had only been the opening act. The true reckoning would begin on the ground. The tires screeched softly as the plane touched down, the force of landing pressing them back into their seats. The engines roared, then eased as the aircraft slowed. Passengers clapped lightly, a tradition some still held, though Naomi barely noticed. Her mind was too focused on what was to come. As the plane taxied to the gate, she caught sight of Clara one last time. The once confident attendant now stood at the rear, her uniform plain, her eyes downcast. Naomi couldn't bring herself to feel pity. Not after what Malik had endured. But she did feel clarity. This was what arrogance brought in the end: exposure, consequence, and a fall that everyone could see. Elena gathered her things calmly, her elegance intact. Malik clutched his toy plane, bouncing slightly in his seat, his excitement for London bubbling over. Naomi adjusted her jacket, her chin lifting higher than it had all night. She was no longer carrying the weight of humiliation. She was carrying pride. David remained still for a moment longer, his gaze on the horizon outside. Then he rose, buttoning his jacket, his presence filling the suite once more. Naomi whispered, "Are you ready?" His answer was calm, certain, always. The seatbelt light dinged off. Passengers began to rise, gathering their bags. The Carters moved as one, their presence commanding in a way that needed no announcement. Eyes followed them as they stepped into the aisle, some curious, some respectful, all aware that they had witnessed something rare. And as they walked toward the exit, Naomi felt it. This was not the end. It was only the threshold. The jet bridge smelled faintly of steel and jet fuel, a sharp contrast to the polished luxury of first class. The Carters walked together, their steps calm and steady. Passengers around them murmured in low voices, stealing glances as if they knew they had witnessed something unusual, something that would travel in whispers long after the flight. Naomi felt the cool air of Heathrow brush against her skin as they entered the private arrivals lounge. Malik skipped slightly ahead, clutching his toy plane in one hand and Elena's fingers in the other. His excitement for London was unshaken, his innocence a bright light after a long night of shadows. David walked slightly ahead of his family, his stride purposeful, his expression calm. To anyone else, he looked like a businessman arriving from an overnight flight. But Naomi knew better. She could feel the energy radiating off him. He wasn't finished. Inside the lounge, a man in a tailored gray suit stood waiting. His tie was slightly loose, his hair peppered with gray, his expression somewhere between nervous and determined. The moment he saw David, he stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Edward Langford, CEO of Atlantic Sky. I understand there was an incident." David accepted the handshake firmly. His eyes were steady, his voice measured. That's putting it lightly. He gestured toward Elena, Naomi, and Malik. "My family boarded this flight expecting the level of service you advertise. What they got was deliberate disrespect and humiliation. You don't just have a bad employee, you have a cultural problem." Langford's throat bobbed as he nodded. "I want to hear your recommendations." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected the CEO himself to listen so directly. She felt her heart pound as her father's voice carried through the lounge. David didn't hesitate. First, Clara Whitmore is removed from any customer-facing role effective immediately. Not reassigned, not warrant removed. Langford nodded, pulling a leather notebook from his jacket. "Done." "Second," David continued, "you conduct a full review of premium service protocols, retrain every senior attendant, not just with lip service, but with enforceable accountability." "Agreed," Langford said, jotting notes quickly. "Third," David said, his voice firm, "you launch a diversity and inclusion program with real authority, not a checkbox exercise. A program with teeth, measurable results, and leadership buy-in." Langford hesitated for only a second before nodding again. "It will be done." David's tone softened slightly, but the steel remained. "And one more thing. You're going to implement a new initiative. Call it Elevate, a mentorship and training pipeline for underrepresented staff to move into leadership roles." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Rachel, who had just entered the lounge, standing uncertainly at the edge. "Rachel Kim will be your first candidate. Promote her to lead attendant on her next flight, and get her into management training." Langford glanced at Rachel, then back to David. Something shifted in his expression. the weight of both obligation and opportunity settling on him. He gave a firm nod. "Consider it done." Rachel's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. She looked from David to Elena, then to Naomi, her hands trembling slightly. Elena gave her a reassuring smile. Naomi felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill. For the first time that night, Naomi saw not just justice for herself, but hope for someone else. Elena placed a hand gently on David's arm. Her voice was soft but certain, turning a bad night into a better future. That's the way to do it. David glanced toward the wide lounge windows, where another Atlantic skyjet was lifting into the pale morning sky. His voice carried calm authority. "If you want a company to rise, you start by making sure everyone on board is treated with the dignity they deserve." Langford extended his hand again, this time with more conviction. "You have my word. Mr. Carter, things will change." David shook his hand firmly. "See that they do." Naomi watched, her chest swelling with pride. The humiliation of hours before seemed distant now, overshadowed by the quiet power of her father's resolve. She glanced at Malik, who was spinning slowly with his toy plane, blissfully unaware of the weight of the moment. She looked at her mother, poised and radiant as always, her eyes glowing with pride in her husband, and she looked at her father, the man who had turned silence into strategy, strategy into justice, and justice into change. The Carters gathered their bags and moved toward the exit. Outside, London spread before them, bustling and alive, the skyline glittering under morning light. The city hummed with possibilities, but Naomi's mind was still on the night sky over the Atlantic, on the lessons she had learned. She tugged gently at her father's sleeve. "Dad." He glanced down at her, his eyes warm. "Why didn't you just end it quickly? Why let it go on for so long?" David's expression softened. "Because sometimes the world needs to see the problem for itself. If I had ended it right away, no one would have learned anything. But by letting her expose herself, every person in that cabin witnessed the truth. And now they can't unsee it." Naomi nodded slowly, her chest tight. "So it wasn't just about us." David's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "It never is." Elena smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind Naomi's ear. "That's what it means to lead. Not just to win the fight, but to make sure the people who come after don't have to fight the same battle." Naomi swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. She thought about Malik, about Rachel, about the next family who might step into first class and be told they didn't belong. And she felt something new take root inside her resolve. As they stepped into the cool London air, David took Elena's hand. Naomi walked close beside them, Malik skipping happily ahead. The family moved forward together, strong, unshaken, carrying with them the weight of what had happened and the promise of what would come next. Naomi looked up at the vast sky, streaked with pale morning clouds. She thought about her father's calm, her mother's steel, her brother's innocence, and her own fire. And she knew this was more than a story about a flight. It was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life, because dignity wasn't a luxury. It was a right, and on that flight, in that cabin, the Carters had reminded everyone of it. As the Carters stepped off that plane, it wasn't just the end of a long flight. It was the beginning of something greater. Clara Whitmore, once confident in her cruelty, had been stripped of her authority for the world to see. Rachel Kim, the attendant who chose kindness, was lifted into opportunity. And David Carter reminded everyone watching that true power isn't about domination. It's about dignity, respect, and leaving the world better for those who come after. Naomi carried with her a new understanding of strength, that silence can be strategy, patience can be power, and justice is most profound when it changes not just one moment, but the entire system behind it. Malak's innocence was protected, Elena's grace never wavered, and David's quiet authority turned humiliation into transformation. But the question remains, how many more families have to endure before real change becomes the norm? And what will we do, each of us, when we witness prejudice in our own lives? If this story moved you, let it be more than just a tale. Let it be a reminder. Respect is not a privilege, it is a right. Thank you for watching. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we'll keep shining a light on the truths that matter and the voices that must never be silenced.